When the floods came and swallowed half the town, no one thought about kindness or future rewards or fate circling back with interest. They only thought about survival. And that's where my story truly begins. Not with success, not with wealth, but with water climbing the walls and people screaming in the dark. Because I was never meant to be anyone important. I was just a woman who owned a warehouse near the old highway, a big, empty concrete building where I stored packaging supplies for my small distribution business. And that night, the rain would not stop. Sirens wailed like the town itself was crying. And by midnight, the river burst its banks and turned streets into rivers. Cars floated like toys, houses collapsed, and people ran with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And when the police knocked on my door asking if I could open my warehouse as an emergency shelter, I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask about liability or compensation or rules. I just grabbed my keys and drove through the water, praying my engine wouldn't die. And when I unlocked those metal doors, strangers poured in, soaking wet, shaking, children crying, elderly people clinging to bags with medicines. And I did what any woman raised by struggle does. I organized. I made space. I found blankets. I boiled water on camping stoves. And for 3 days, that warehouse became a small world of fear, hope, hunger, and survival. And that's when I noticed her, the silent pregnant woman. She arrived alone. No family, no luggage, just a thin shawl around her shoulders and hands always resting on her belly as if she was guarding something precious from the world. She never complained, never asked for extra food, never spoke unless spoken to, and even then, her answers were short, polite, almost cautious, like someone used to being invisible. And while others argued and panicked, she sat quietly on a folded blanket in the corner, eyes always watching, absorbing everything. And something about her stayed with me. Maybe it was the way she helped other people's children before herself, or how she cleaned up without being asked, or how at night, when everyone slept, I once caught her whispering to her unborn child like she was making promises to a future she desperately wanted to reach. And when the floodwaters finally receded and people returned to whatever was left of their lives, the warehouse emptied, one family at a time. Hugs were exchanged, tears were shed, and thank yous were spoken. But the pregnant woman waited until the very end. She stood in front of me, pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand with an address written on it, looked me straight in the eyes for the first time, and said, "One day, if you ever need anything, come here." And before I could ask her name or say anything meaningful, she walked away. And I remember thinking how strange it was, how dramatic even, because in real life, people don't usually say things like that. And life moved on, as it always does. The floods became a memory, the town rebuilt, my warehouse returned to being just a warehouse, and I went back to running my business, working long hours, dealing with suppliers, chasing payments, fixing forklifts, living a quiet life that never made headlines. Years passed, 5 of them, then 7, and just when I thought stability was finally within reach, fire took everything. It started at night, an electrical fault, they later said, and by the time I got there, flames were devouring the building I had once turned into a shelter. Firefighters battled the blaze, smoke burned my eyes, and I stood there watching years of work collapse into ash, convinced this was the end. Because my insurance company didn't see it as a tragedy, they saw it as an opportunity to deny. Paperwork delays, fine print exclusions, investigations that dragged on for months, until finally a cold letter arrived saying my claim was rejected. And I broke down. Not in public, not in front of anyone, but alone in my car. Because betrayal doesn't always come from people. Sometimes it comes from systems you trusted. And I thought about selling what little I had left, about starting over at an age where starting over feels cruel. And then, one afternoon, while I was sorting through burnt invoices in my temporary office, a black luxury car pulled up outside. 2 men in suits stepped out, calm, confident, the kind of men who don't waste time. And when they asked for me by name, I assumed they were lawyers sent by the insurance company to finish me off. But instead, they handed me documents, thick, official, stamped, and said words that made no sense at first. Words about ownership, transfers, holdings, and assets far beyond anything I had ever touched. And as I stared at those papers, confused and shaking, one sentence echoed in my mind like a voice from the past. One day, if you ever need anything, come here. And that's when I realized the flood hadn't ended my story. It had planted something that was only now beginning to grow. And I had no idea yet that this was just the first twist, because the kindness I showed without witnesses had been recorded in ways I never imagined. And the fire that destroyed my business was about to expose secrets, power, and betrayals that would test everything I believed about gratitude, loyalty, and the true cost of doing the right thing. And this is where my real story begins. Not with the flood, not with the fire, but with the moment I realized the silent woman I once sheltered was never just a stranger, and the life she carried that night would change mine forever. I didn't sleep that night after the men in suits left, because once you've lived a life where nothing ever comes easy, miracles don't feel like blessings, they feel like traps. And I sat alone with those documents spread across my desk, rereading words I barely understood. Ownership stakes, controlling interest, beneficiary clauses, irrevocable trusts. Numbers so large they looked like printing errors. And my first thought wasn't joy, it was fear. Because wealth has a smell to it, and I could already sense trouble circling. So the next morning, I called the number printed on the letterhead, and by afternoon, I was sitting across from a team of lawyers who spoke gently but precisely, explaining that years ago, a private holding company had been structured in such a way that if certain conditions were met, control would transfer to me. Conditions that had nothing to do with business performance and everything to do with character. And when I asked the only question that mattered, why me, the lead attorney paused, looked at me carefully, and said that the original founder had insisted the future owner be someone who helped her at her most vulnerable moment without knowing who she was. And that was when the memory of the flood came back sharper than ever. The cold concrete floor, the dim emergency lights, the woman's hands on her belly, the folded paper with the address. And suddenly, I understood that address wasn't an offer of help, it was a promise backed by preparation. Because while I went back to my quiet life after the flood, she went on to build an empire, and she never forgot the woman who gave her shelter when she had nothing to give in return. But what the lawyers told me next shattered any illusion that this gift would come without cost, because the transfer had been delayed for years due to internal resistance, lawsuits, and deliberate obstruction by people who assumed the founder would never follow through, people who had grown comfortable in power they didn't truly own. And now that the conditions were triggered by my financial ruin and insurance rejection, the transfer was legally unavoidable, and that's when the threats began. Not dramatic at first, just anonymous emails warning me to walk away, phone calls that hung up when I answered, former executives of companies I'd never heard of suddenly wanting meetings, smiling too much, speaking too softly, suggesting I sell my stake quickly before things got complicated. And it was in one of those meetings that I realized betrayal wasn't coming, it was already here. Because one man leaned forward and said, almost kindly, that accidents like warehouse fires had a way of repeating themselves. And I went home shaking, because kindness had brought me to a battlefield I never asked to enter. And then the past hit me again from a different angle when a woman came to see me unannounced. Mid-30s, elegant, confident, eyes too familiar. And the moment she spoke my name, I knew. She was the child from the flood, the baby the silent woman had been carrying, grown now, sharp, composed, and carrying grief behind her eyes, because her mother was gone, taken by illness 2 years earlier. And before she died, she made sure the legal machinery would eventually find me. And as we sat together, she told me the story I had never known, how her mother had been escaping an abusive family tied into powerful business circles, how the flood gave her cover to disappear, how the warehouse became the first place she felt safe enough to plan a future, how the quiet wasn't weakness, but survival, and how she built everything with one rule, that kindness repaid must never look like charity only justice. But after her mother's death, the people she had trusted turned vicious, rewriting narratives, forging documents, draining accounts, assuming the final clause naming me would never activate. And now they saw me as an obstacle, an outsider they could pressure, intimidate, or erase. And I wanted to run, I won't lie, because I didn't ask for this war. I didn't want power. I wanted my burned warehouse back and a quiet life. But the daughter looked at me and said something that locked my spine straight. She said that her mother believed people are tested twice, once when they have nothing and once when they're handed everything. And walking away now would make all that kindness meaningless. So I agreed to fight. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I realized the fire that destroyed my business wasn't random, it was a message. And if I stepped back now, it wouldn't stop. And that's when the real betrayals surfaced. Arson investigators reopening my case quietly, financial trails linking insurance consultants to holding company insiders, evidence that the denial of my claim was influenced, engineered to force the condition that transferred ownership, meaning my ruin had been accelerated by people who thought they could control the outcome. And suddenly, I wasn't just a beneficiary, I was proof of their crimes. And the more we uncovered, the uglier it got. Board members turning on each other, whistleblowers crawling out of silence, court filings piling up. And through it all, I kept remembering the warehouse during the flood, how power then meant having a flashlight and a blanket, not money or titles. And every time fear crept in, I thought about that woman trusting a stranger with her unborn child's safety. And I understood that the story wasn't about me being rewarded. It was about a cycle completing itself, kindness returning not as gratitude, but as responsibility. And as the first court hearing date was set and my name began appearing in places I never imagined, I knew the biggest twist was still ahead. Because the people fighting me weren't just greedy, they were desperate. And desperate people don't lose quietly. They burn everything they touch, including each other. And I was about to learn just how far they would go to keep power they never truly earned. By the time the first hearing arrived, my name had become something I barely recognized because it was no longer attached to a woman who once slept on an office couch after double shifts or a business owner who worried about forklift repairs. It was now printed in bold on legal documents, whispered in hallways, searched online, and spoken with resentment by people who had everything to lose. And that kind of attention changes how the world looks at you. Friends become cautious. Distant relatives suddenly remember birthdays. Strangers smile a little too eagerly. And enemies you've never met start planning your downfall. And the strangest part was how calm I became once the chaos peaked, because fear burns hottest before acceptance, and I had crossed that line quietly. I stopped asking why this was happening to me and started asking what it demanded of me. And the answer came fast, because days before the hearing, the daughter called me late at night, voice tight, telling me they had tried to settle with her privately, offering money, threatening exposure, hinting at scandals involving her mother they could reveal if she didn't convince me to step aside. And when she refused, they moved to their next tactic. Delay, filing motions to challenge my mental fitness, my business history, even my character, painting me as unstable, irresponsible, a small-town operator unqualified to hold stakes in a global structure. And I read those filings with a kind of detached disbelief, because every accusation was built on fragments of truth, twisted just enough to sting. My warehouse fire, my denied insurance claim, my temporary financial strain. And I realized then that betrayal doesn't need lies. It only needs context stripped away. And in court, they tried to make me look like a lucky accident, a clerical error, someone who wandered into power by mistake. And I let them talk, because the one thing I had learned from running a warehouse during a flood was that panic wastes energy. So when it was my turn to speak, I didn't argue numbers or contracts. I told the story they couldn't erase, about opening doors in the rain, about people sleeping on concrete, about a pregnant woman who never asked for special treatment, and about how I didn't even know her name when I helped her. and the courtroom shifted. Not dramatically, not emotionally, but perceptibly, because systems understand evidence, but people understand stories. And from that day on, things began to crack in ways none of us expected. One executive flipped to save himself, producing emails that showed how they'd pressured the insurance company through intermediaries to stall my claim, how they expected me to fold under financial stress, how they referred to me as temporary, manageable, disposable. And when that evidence surfaced, the tone changed. Suddenly, the men who once warned me about accidents wanted meetings again, this time with apologies rehearsed too late. And that was when the second betrayal hit. Quieter, but deeper, because someone from my own past, someone I had trusted years ago with my warehouse accounts, testified against me, claiming I had staged the fire for leverage. And sitting there listening to that familiar voice accuse me felt worse than any threat, because it reminded me that loyalty isn't guaranteed by history, it's renewed daily by choice. And that choice had been made against me. But even that backfired on them when financial records surfaced, proving that same person had been paid through shell companies tied to the holding group. And as the web unraveled, it became clear that my story was never meant to be hidden, it was meant to be buried, and only the fire had burned the cover away. And while all of this played out in courtrooms and offices, the daughter and I had our own reckoning, because power doesn't just attract enemies, it tests alliances. And there were nights she questioned whether dragging me into this was right, whether her mother would have wanted this level of destruction. And I told her the truth, that her mother didn't leave me wealth, she left me a mirror. And what I saw in it now was someone who couldn't walk away without becoming complicit. And that was the moment our bond shifted from obligation to purpose, because we weren't fighting for ownership anymore. We were fighting to expose a system that thrived on exploiting silence, the same silence that once kept a pregnant woman safe, now weaponized to keep powerful men untouchable. And the biggest twist came when a sealed file was unsealed, one that revealed the holding company had been built originally as a shield, not a profit machine, a way for her mother to protect assets from abusive relatives and political allies who used intimidation as currency. And the clause naming me wasn't sentimental, it was strategic, because she believed the safest person to trust with power was someone who never sought it. And sitting there, reading her words years after she wrote them, I finally cried. Not for the warehouse, not for the fire, but for the weight of being seen so clearly by someone who barely spoke to me. And as the final judgment loomed closer, I knew winning would change my life forever. But losing would change more than just mine, because by then, journalists were watching, regulators were circling, and people who thought they could quietly destroy a woman's livelihood were realizing that the stranger they underestimated had become the center of a storm they could no longer control. And in that tension, in that silence before the verdict, I understood the deepest truth of all. That kindness doesn't just come back as reward. Sometimes it comes back as a responsibility so heavy it reshapes who you are. And whether the court ruled in my favor or not, the flood that night years ago had already decided the kind of woman I would be when the water receded again. The verdict didn't come with fireworks or gasps or dramatic pauses like people imagine from movies. It arrived on an ordinary morning with a judge who looked tired of lies and a courtroom that felt heavy with consequences. And when the ruling confirmed the transfer as valid and ordered a full forensic investigation into the sabotage, the room didn't erupt. It deflated, because everyone there understood this wasn't an ending, it was an unraveling. And as people stood to leave, I felt something unexpected settle over me. Not victory, not relief, but gravity, because the weight of what I now held was real. And outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, microphones appeared, questions flew, and for the first time, I understood how power isolates, because no answer I gave could capture the truth without being twisted. So I said very little. And that silence frustrated them more than any statement could have. And behind the scenes, the consequences hit fast. Accounts were frozen, executives resigned overnight, board members turned on each other with stunning speed, each one eager to cooperate before being named. And I watched it all from a distance, because while they scrambled to protect themselves, I was facing a different kind of reckoning. The reality that the holding company controlled industries I knew nothing about, supply chains across borders, workers whose livelihoods now indirectly depended on decisions I had the authority to influence. And that responsibility terrified me more than any courtroom threat ever had, because incompetence can harm just as deeply as malice. And that's when the daughter stepped fully into her role. Not as a grieving child anymore, but as a strategist, guiding me through structures her mother had designed precisely for this moment. Layers of oversight, ethics committees, independent audits, safeguards meant to prevent exactly the abuse we were now exposing. And I realized her mother hadn't just trusted me blindly. She had built a system that assumed human weakness and planned around it. And as we activated those protections, another betrayal surfaced, one that cut closer than I expected. Because a politician who had publicly praised me during the trial privately tried to leverage his support into influence, hinting at regulatory favors he expected in return. And when I refused, his tone changed instantly. And within days, negative stories began circulating, anonymous tips questioning my past, my motives, my mental health. And that's when I learned the most dangerous betrayal comes disguised as alliance, because enemies announce themselves, opportunists pretend to stand beside you. And it took everything I had not to lash out, not to defend myself loudly. But restraint turned out to be my sharpest weapon, because every smear was met with documentation, every rumor answered with transparency, and slowly the narrative shifted again, from scandal to something far more uncomfortable for them: accountability. And the insurance company reopened my claim under regulatory pressure, quietly, without apology. And while the payout couldn't undo the loss of my warehouse, it confirmed what I had suspected all along, that my ruin had been engineered. And as settlements were reached and indictments prepared, people started approaching me differently, not as a victim or a curiosity, but as a gatekeeper. And I hated that word, because it implied exclusion. But what I was really doing was enforcing boundaries, something I had never been taught to do when survival required saying yes to everything. And in the middle of all this, I finally went to the address the pregnant woman had given me years ago, a modest house, now empty, preserved almost like a shrine. And inside, I found journals, not about money or power, but about fear, escape, rebuilding. And one entry stopped me cold, because she wrote about the flood as the moment she decided to live without asking permission ever again. And she described me not as a savior, but as proof that decency still existed without conditions. And reading that, I understood something fundamental, that the empire wasn't built to reward kindness, it was built to protect it from being crushed. And by the time the final wave of resignations hit and the criminal cases moved forward, I was exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix, but also changed, because the woman who once unlocked a warehouse door in the rain would never again underestimate the impact of a simple decision. And as the daughter and I stood together watching the sunset after another long day of damage control, she asked me quietly if I regretted helping her mother that night. And for the first time since this all began, I smiled without fear, because regret belongs to people who act for reward, and I had acted because it was right. And no matter how many enemies that created, no matter how heavy the responsibility became, that choice remained the truest thing about me. And with the storm finally breaking, I knew one last truth was waiting to surface, one final twist that would test whether the cycle of betrayal truly ended here, or whether power would demand an even greater sacrifice before it let us go. Just when I thought the worst had already shown its face, when indictments were drafted and the public began to lose interest because outrage has a short attention span, the final test arrived quietly, without sirens or threats, because the most dangerous turning points never announce themselves. They slip in disguised as opportunity. And it began with a proposal placed on my desk by advisors who spoke in numbers and growth projections, a restructuring plan that would triple profits, stabilize markets, silence critics, and make everything easier. And all it required was one compromise. Just one exception written into policy that would allow a certain subsidiary to operate beyond the ethical framework her mother had designed. And they framed it as harmless, necessary, even responsible, telling me this was how the real world worked, that ideals were expensive, that people would lose jobs if I didn't adapt. And I understood in that moment that this was the true inheritance I'd been given. Not wealth, not control, but a choice that would never stop repeating itself in different forms. And I felt the same pressure I'd felt years ago in the flood, when people begged for space and safety, and I had to decide quickly who I was going to be. And the betrayal here wasn't personal. It was philosophical, because these weren't villains. They were professionals who believed morality was flexible under pressure. And saying no meant risking instability, investor backlash, media attacks, and possibly losing everything I had just fought to secure. And for one long night, I sat alone reading those journals again, hearing her voice between the lines, not telling me what to do, only reminding me why she built what she built. And the next morning, I rejected the proposal, cleanly, publicly, without apology. And the fallout was immediate. Stock volatility, resignations, analysts calling me reckless, naive, unqualified. And for the first time since the trial, doubt crept in, because doing the right thing doesn't always feel righteous. Sometimes it feels lonely and expensive. And then the final twist revealed itself, because an independent audit triggered by that refusal uncovered something no one had been looking for, a long-buried channel of exploitation tied to the same people who had orchestrated the fire and insurance sabotage. A system so normalized it had survived multiple leadership changes. And had I accepted that small compromise, it would have made me complicit overnight. And when that truth came out, the narrative shifted one last time. Not to praise, not to outrage, but to something far rarer: trust. Regulators stepped back. Long-term partners stayed. Workers spoke up. Protections strengthened, and the cycle finally broke. Not with revenge, not with punishment alone, but with exposure and refusal. And years later, when the story faded and my name stopped appearing in headlines, I rebuilt my warehouse. Not bigger, not flashier, but stronger. And I added one permanent feature: a designated emergency shelter space, stocked and ready. Because floods come back, fires come back, and choices come back too. And when people ask me now how my life changed so dramatically, I don't talk about documents or courts or power. I talk about a door opened in the rain, about silence that wasn't weakness, about kindness given without witnesses. Because in the end, that was the moment everything else grew from, and the greatest betrayal would have been forgetting that. By the time the dust truly settled, when the last case was closed and the last article archived and the last opportunist moved on in search of an easier target, I finally understood that endings don't arrive as clean conclusions. They arrive as quieter transformations. And my life after everything did not look like a victory lap or a fairy tale. It looked ordinary again, deliberately so. Because after witnessing how power distorts, I chose containment over expansion, stewardship over domination. And the greatest irony was that once I stopped chasing control, control loosened its grip on me. The rebuilt warehouse opened its doors not as a symbol of success, but as a promise kept. The emergency shelter stood ready, stocked, maintained, ignored most days. And that was exactly how I wanted it. because preparedness is meant to be invisible until the moment it saves someone. And sometimes late at night, I would walk through that quiet space and remember the flood, the smell of wet concrete, the low hum of fear, the sound of people breathing close together in the dark. And I would wonder how many lives intersect for only a moment before diverging forever, how many choices feel small because no one is watching, and how those are the ones that echo the longest. And the daughter stayed in my life, not as a business partner or an heir to some legacy, but as family, chosen through trial rather than blood. And together, we honored her mother in the only way that mattered, by refusing to let what she built become another weapon in the wrong hands. And sometimes people would ask me if I ever felt used, if I ever wondered whether the kindness I gave that night had been part of a larger design. And the truth is, I did think about it. Often, but I always arrived at the same answer, that intention matters more than outcome. Because if I had known who she was, what she would become, what she would one day give back, the act would have been transactional, and then it would have meant nothing. And the world has enough transactions disguised as generosity. What it lacks are moments of decency that don't demand return. And in the years that followed, I watched storms come and go, literal ones and human ones, and each time the doors opened again, I saw fear soften into relief the same way it had before. And I never told anyone why that shelter existed or what it once set in motion, because stories don't need to be repeated to be true. They just need to be lived through once. And if there is any lesson buried beneath all the betrayal, the fire, the courts, the wealth, it is this: that goodness does not protect you from suffering, it prepares you to survive it without becoming something unrecognizable. And when my time comes to leave this world, I won't measure my life by what I owned or controlled. I'll measure it by the doors I opened when it would have been easier to keep them shut. Because everything that followed, the loss, the power, the responsibility, the restoration, was just consequence unfolding, and the flood that destroyed half a town did not create my destiny. It simply revealed who I already was. And that, more than anything I gained or lost afterward, is the ending I choose to keep.